Welcome to Mortification of Spin, a casual conversation about things that count, with Carl Trueman and Todd Pruitt, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. Let's join this week's conversation.
You are listening to Mortification of Spin. My name is Todd Pruitt, with you as always. I'm the pastor of Covenant Presbyterian Church in Harrisonburg, Virginia, in the lovely Shenandoah Valley. And I'm joined as always by my co-host and my friend of many years now, Carl Trueman of Grove City College in Western Pennsylvania. Carl, it's good to see you. How are things out in the middle of nowhere?
Just wrapped up finals, finished all my grading, and ready for graduation. So it's that sweet spot in the year when I have no responsibilities. Hence, I'm wearing a T-shirt instead of my trademark dress shirt and tie for these recordings.
It's scandalous. It's scandalous, really. Although I would have been super impressed had you worn a Mortification of Spin sleeveless T-shirt. That would have been...
Sleeveless T-shirts should not even exist. I think they're a product of the fall, as far as I'm concerned. There were no sleeveless T-shirts in the Garden of Eden.
It's probably because you have hairy shoulders. We would have mistaken you for Sasquatch or something like that.
That could be in the realm of too much information at this point. So.
Well, from the ridiculous to the sublime, how about this for a transition? We are pleased to have with us today as a guest, Dr. Ewan Goligher, who is a medical doctor. He's also a PhD, and he's Canadian as well. There are, now I know a number of good things that come out of Canada. You have Michael J. Fox, you have Rush, and you have Ewan Goligher. So
Shania Twain, don't forget Shania Twain.
There you go. Yeah. So it keeps getting better for Canada. But Dr. Goligher is our guest, and the main reason we're having him on is because of a book he has written for Lexham Press. And shout out to Lexham Press; they continue to publish just great stuff on a whole variety of issues related to Christian ethics and theology. And Dr. Goligher's book is entitled, "How Should We Then Die? A Christian Response to Physician-Assisted Death." Dr. Goligher, thank you so much for being on with us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I have to say that's a lineup I never thought I'd be part of, with Shania Twain and Rush and so on. But
well, I want you to know that Carl and I have been to a Rush concert together. And so it was on their final tour, and we were there. So we felt very Canadian for a few moments.
My lasting memory of that concert was looking around and the audience, and it was almost all bald, middle-aged men. And I remember thinking, I am among my people. I am among my people.
all playing air drums. Yes, it's true. It's
one of the greatest nights of my life.
Absolutely.
Fantastic.
Great time. Well, as we were talking earlier before we went on the air, I'm so grateful for the number of books and number of resources that are available for Christians in relation to the subject of abortion. And there's wonderful, wonderful material out there. What there's very little material on is on this other ethical crisis, which is physician-assisted suicide, physician-assisted death. And so I'm very thankful for the importance of Dr. Goligher's book, the timeliness of it, the readability of it, and how he just expertly gets to the point time and time again. So first of all, Ewan, thank you so much for the book. I'm so glad you took the time to address this. I want to ask you two questions to kind of begin with. One is, why did you write this? Why was this the issue you really wanted to dedicate time to produce a book on? And I wonder if you could just give us a little bit of an idea of where the current trends are in terms of Western Europe and North America. Like how is this getting worse, and how so?
Yeah, I decided to write a book about this topic after wrestling with the issue for a couple of years and looking around and searching for good reference material and not finding something that was ideal and accessible the way that I thought was needed. Like you said, I'm an MD, I'm a PhD. My PhD is in physiology. I'm not an ethicist by background, but this issue of assisted death forced its way into my life in 2014, 2015, around the time it was legalized in Canada. And because I practice intensive care, I deal with a lot of end-of-life care ethics and issues in my practice. And it was just became clear to me that given the nature of my practice and the widespread acceptance of assisted death in Canada, that those of us who objected were going to need to be able to give a clear account of why we wouldn't participate, why we were opposed. Indeed, we've been under immense pressure to participate in Ontario. It's one of the few places in the world where physicians are expected to make an effective referral to a willing provider on this. So there's a huge amount of pressure, just socially speaking, professionally speaking. And so I wanted to be able to give a clear account. There is no question that in our post-Christian, progressively secularizing societies in the West, there is growing acceptance and advocacy for the practice of physician-assisted death. So it was legal in Belgium and the Netherlands for quite some time. Then in Canada, about 10 years ago, it became socially acceptable and was legalized. There's quite a number of states in the United States where some form of assisted death is legal, and there's a push, say, for example, in California to expand to include euthanasia, which is the practice of directly administering the lethal dose of drug to the patient. And there's other countries in Western Europe as well where this is being actively either legalized or being pushed for legalized. There's been multiple pushes in the UK and so on. So it's really kind of a global issue in the West, at least. And I think that the experience in Canada is that increasingly people know a friend, a loved one, a family member who's grappling with this issue and facing this question. And so it's really become something that's on a lot of people's minds.
Yeah. I wonder if you could make an important distinction that perhaps may have been some of our listeners may not sort of grasp it, and that's the difference between, say, recently we had a friend who was very, very ill with breast cancer, and she made a decision late on that no more treatment. I'm going to allow the disease to take its course, but I'm going to be conscious to be able to spend some quality time with my family. I wonder if you could just distinguish for some of our listeners the moral difference between somebody saying, okay, I'm no longer going to be treated for this disease, and somebody seeking physician-assisted death. What's the difference, and how would you morally parse the difference between those two? I think it's a distinction that some people, it's a bit blurred in their minds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. It is a critical distinction to make, because one of the arguments that was made when assisted death was first being discussed in Canada, particularly amongst in my professional world in the ICU, where we withhold or withdraw life-sustaining measures regularly, is that, hey, we're already deciding the timing of people's death. What's the difference with euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide? But the critical difference is that when you perform assisted suicide or euthanasia, you're deliberately aiming at causing somebody's death. That's the intention, and that's the goal of the action. Whereas when your friend or your loved one says, hey, I'm putting limits on what I will do in order to try and prolong life at the cost of significant suffering, you're essentially saying there are these treatments aren't going to work. They're not going to achieve their intended effect. And it's time for me to accept that the inevitable outcome here is death. And so the focus moves to optimizing comfort and ensuring quality of life. But at no time when you're doing that are you saying, I'm trying to cause my death. And that's the critical difference. When you're performing euthanasia, you're trying to cause the patient's death. And so I think that really is what I wanted to address in the book, is what exactly is wrong with deliberately aiming at causing someone's death? Because that's really the crux of the moral issue.
Yeah. Ewan, when we hear about physician-assisted suicide or doctor-assisted death, I wonder if you could, for those that are unaware of some of the ways that this is done actually, some of the practices involved in this. I wonder if you could just kind of help our audience understand that a little bit.
Yeah, physician-assisted suicide is the act of providing a lethal prescription of a sedative in a very high dose to a patient, which they would then ingest themselves.
Right.
Euthanasia is the practice of actually directly administering the lethal drugs to the patient. Interestingly, in jurisdictions where both assisted suicide and euthanasia are legal, patients seem to vastly prefer euthanasia. They prefer to have someone else do it for them. And this is one of the reasons why when you only legalize assisted suicide, you don't see nearly the same degree of uptake in the practice.
Wow.
But the act of euthanasia, I think it's actually important to describe what you actually do when you're doing that, because it really gives people clarity about what it's about. First you'll administer a sedative to, put the patient to sleep. Then you administer a very high dose of an intravenous anesthetic, essentially to shut the brain off and to shut off the drive to breathe. Then you administer a drug to paralyze the breathing muscles so that you ensure that all breathing is halted. And then a drug or an electrolyte solution is administered to stop the heart from beating. So it's a series of actions which really directly take aim at the function of the body and seek to end it.
It seems very similar to having a dog put down. I remember when we had my Jack Russell put to sleep, a series of injections were given with a sort of cumulative effect. Very chilling when you think about it in that way.
Yeah.
That is one of the important actually comparisons that people have in their experience though, right?
Right.
And one of the arguments that we really need to grapple with is, hey, if I won't let my animal suffer like this, then why would I let my loved one suffer like this? Or why would I be forced to suffer like this? So this actually, just bringing up the comparison, is again one of the thorny issues and distinctions we have to work out when we're talking about this issue.
And that's why we can't help but ask, metaphysical types of questions, quote, religious types of questions. And you make that connection very clearly in the book. And one of the things that's interesting about your book is you kind of point to religious underpinnings of the doctor-assisted death movement. What are some of those religious connections or metaphysical presuppositions that doctor-assisted death has to have in order to rest upon?
The logic of assisted death is predicated on the idea that you're rendering someone better off by ending their life. And in the philosophical and ethical literature where people write about this, they represent the logic as a kind of calculus, where you weigh up the good of remaining alive and the bad of remaining alive, and you essentially decide, if the bad of remaining alive outweighs the good, then it makes sense to end my life. And the glaring gap in that logic is that it ignores the question of what is it like to be dead. And, I was so struck in the social conversation in Canada about this issue that nobody ever brought that up. What is it like to be dead? And I think it reveals the way that we take for granted a certain sort of metaphysical vision of the world where, that might technically be referred to as metaphysical naturalism, where everything that exists is just material stuff.
Yeah.
The only reality is what you can see and touch and taste with sense experience. And so if a person's dead and they have no possibility of physical experience, then there's nothing beyond that for them. It just takes for granted that kind of secular humanist vision of reality. And to me, that makes this act a profound act of faith, because you don't actually know, and nor do you actually have any evidence that you're right about that, but you're willing to, go out on a limb and end your life on the belief that that you'll be better off, when in fact it's, I call it a secular act of blind faith in the book for that reason. So, at the end of the day, you can't talk about death without getting into these kinds of fundamental religious or quasi-religious issues. Yeah.
And it seems to really be built strongly on that on a series of kind of just materialistic presuppositions, that if all we are is the collision of gases and dust, ultimately, then then having a doctor kill us doesn't seem nearly as complicated ethically as it otherwise would be. And so it really does depend on some form of a nihilism to one degree or another, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And the irony, of course, is that, if, the moral vision that on which this is predicated, the idea that we're respecting people's autonomy, we're respecting their dignity, all of those ideas become utterly nonsensical.
Yeah.
Under the kind of materialistic vision that people are assuming. So there's a deep-rooted paradoxical or kind of contradiction within the practice itself, the way that we see people as possessed of dignity, while also saying we're really just, atoms and molecules in motion. Yeah. This is the critical question. I would say that churches have a responsibility in what I might call the realm of ideas and in the realm of action. In the realm of ideas, I think it's so critical for pastoral leaders to be seeking to disciple their people in a deep understanding of theological anthropology, human value, the doctrine of the image of God, and to equip people with the language to explain why it is that we oppose this, framed in terms of the depth of human value, helping people to articulate a clear Christian vision for just how much people matter and where that value comes from, and having that sort of deep-rooted sense that, in a lot of ways, people are sacred, and to lift our hand to them is actually an act of desecration. I think, Carl, you wrote a very nice piece in First Things not that long ago, talking about the desecration of man, and I see assisted death as a kind of paradigm case of the desecration of man. And so helping our fellow believers to understand at a deep level just how significant we are in God's sight, and what that implies for the fact that the wrongness of lifting our hand to end someone. I also think that in the realm of action, we need to cultivate communities where we actively look out for people who are vulnerable to doubting their own value. When you're beset with illness, burdened with disability, socially isolated, we've all become very quickly inclined to doubt our value, to doubt our significance. And when we're isolated and feeling just like a burden, we're profoundly tempted by the prospect of an easy escape. But it's when we're surrounded by a loving community that through word and deed reminds us just how much we matter, simply by their presence, simply by act of hospitality, just by saying in these very practical and simple ways, it's good that you're here. That, I think, very powerfully helps to insulate people from the temptation to seek death. So I think that in a lot of ways, it's just becoming a more biblical and Christ-like community, and cultivating that servant-hearted love toward one another will help to equip people. And then finally, I would say equipping people with the philosophy of suffering, to anticipate suffering, to understand it, and knowing exactly how to see that it does not rob them of meaning and purpose and value. That, I think that a deep-seated philosophy of suffering is really, really important.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the things that comes up is that suffering is bad. We can, as Christians, we can categorically say suffering does not belong to the original creation. It's ultimately part of the bitter fruit of sin. And so we can say suffering is bad. But there are things that are worse than suffering. It's suffering is not the ultimate human evil. It's a condition of the fall, but there are things that are worse.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the Polish poet Czesław Miłosz's comment during the Second World War when he's writing to a friend, and he makes a comment there that as soon as you've lost sight of man as made in the image of God, we become nothing more than sort of animated pieces of meat, essentially. And he's in the context, of course, of thinking about how is it that young, intelligent, thoughtful German men are committing these horrendous atrocities in Poland, butchering these Jewish communities. Why is it that very civilized people can do such inhuman things? But there's a sense in which that's where society is now, in a lot of ways.
Yeah, we've really trained as a culture. We've trained ourselves to see ourselves as a means to an end.
Yeah.
And this is the kind of the way in which I think assisted death devalues a person, is that you treat yourself like a means to an end. If your existence is no longer useful to you, well, then it's entirely appropriate for you to end yourself. And it's as if your existence only matters if you're useful to yourself. And so that vision of treating yourself as a means to an end, I think, actually infiltrates so many of the different kinds of ethical and moral issues that we're grappling with. And so I appreciated the opportunity with this issue to sort of bring that out.
Yeah, to address yeah, I'm just going to say just to push back against this utilitarian idea of the human self. And I really appreciate what you said earlier about the importance of community on this issue. The church has to move towards those who are suffering physically, to not allow them to be alone in it, to support them. And Carl, as you mentioned at the top of the program with your first question, if we have a neighbor, if we have a brother and sister in Christ who's suffering through a chronic illness, if they come to a point where they say no more treatment, that there's a way for us to honor that, and that's an entirely different thing than this other. There's a way to honor that, and to not demand, for maybe sentimental reasons on our end, an extension of life that goes beyond what this person can bear. So again, the refusal of treatment is very much within the orbit of a proper understanding of human dignity, of human agency, of honoring the person as a creation of God, and allowing that decision to be made within a conversation with doctors and with your family and with your church. But I find oftentimes that we want to pull back from the chronic issues. We're pretty good on crisis issues at the moment, but it's the long-lasting chronic ones where the church really needs to work on excelling more. And because these poor souls, they become very lonely and isolated in their suffering. And that's one of the reasons why I think they will sometimes turn to this other option. So all the more encouragement for the church to be that fellowship.
And that's why we would certainly recommend to all our listeners to get hold of a copy of Ewan Goligher's book, How Should We Then Die? A Christian Response to Physician-Assisted Death, published by our friends at Lexham Press, as Todd said earlier, publishing some excellent and extremely useful books, both theologically and pastorally. So I want to thank you for coming on the program, Ewan. We look forward to future work that you do, as this is extremely helpful and in an area where a lot of us have not thought very deeply at all. So thanks so much for your work. Thank you out there for listening. If you care to visit our website, mortificationspin.org, you have a chance there to enter to win a copy of Dr. Goligher's book, How Should We Then Die? And if while you're visiting our website, you feel led to make a donation, remember we are a donor-supported podcast and greatly appreciate any donation, great or small, that you might care to make. In the meantime, all that remains is for me to thank Dr. Goligher once again for joining us, and thank you for listening. Look forward to being with you next time.
All this machinery making modern music can still be open-hearted. Not so fully charted, it's really just a question of your honesty. Yeah, your honesty. One likes to believe in the freedom of music.
Thanks for listening to Mortification of Spin, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. For more on topics like this, visit mortificationofspin.org, where you can find other articles by Carl and Todd, browse the archive of past episodes, and make a donation. We'll talk to you next time on Mortification of Spin.